Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all participants. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for our webinar on two sides of the same coin, the benefits and risks of the use and misuse of uncrewed systems. My name is Bárbara Moraes. I'm a researcher in the Conventional Arms and Ammunition Program of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR, and will be moderating today's event. Uncrewed systems, which include uncrewed aerial, ground, and maritime systems, are increasingly being developed and used by a range of state and non-state actors in the military realm. The increased development and use of these systems has also been enabled by lower cost of production and technological advances, which have made them easier to use over longer periods of time and with additional and more advanced capabilities. As such, the attractiveness and use of such systems has grown considerably over recent years. The combination of these elements also introduces important questions about proliferation and misuse, as well as regulatory measures and countermeasures. It is with this context in mind that UNIDIR and UNODA are co-organizing a series of 3 webinars generously funded by Portugal. The overarching objective of this webinar series is to stimulate discussion between a range of stakeholders on key topics relating to uncrewed systems and identify areas of continued challenge, including gaps in knowledge and policy, as well as possible avenues for action. We are joined today by a range of representatives from member states, UN entities, civil society, and the private sector, and we are very pleased to welcome you all to the second webinar in our 3-part series, which will unpack the risks and benefits associated with the use of uncrewed systems. A number of terms are used in relation to such systems, in particular, uncrewed aerial systems, which are the focus of our series. There's also a multitude of classification systems to categorize the systems and describe their components. Our first webinar of this series, held in the beginning of July, focused on unpacking some of these different terms and categorizations, as well as examining the usefulness and continued pertinence in light of current and emerging trends in the development, acquisition, and use of such systems by different actors. The range of terminology that exists is often as varied as the amount of stakeholders who consider these systems within their areas of work. As we also heard from our speakers then, while there might be good reasons for why such different terms and terminologies are used, it is important to be clear and transparent from the outset about what they're referring to within different contexts and to apply such terms in a consistent manner. However, regardless of the type and of the terms that are used to refer to them, the systems in all shapes and forms have become a mainstay of contemporary military operations and are proliferating at a rapid pace around the world, being used by an increasingly diverse set of actors, both state and non-state alike, for a variety of purposes. We are therefore seeing not only the widening spectrum of systems in the sky above us, but also of the type of actors that are deploying them, as well as of the geographical scope of their operations. The use of these systems can provide a number of benefits to military operations and have also several positive applications much beyond the military realm. Yet, the increased proliferation and potential misuse can also present important risks and challenges to human, national, regional, and international security and stability. In today's webinar, we will therefore explore some of these risks and benefits, including the broader impacts of their use on peace and security, especially when compared to crewed systems. We will also examine how different types of actors may deploy these systems, as well as the variance of use across regions. But before welcoming our speakers and diving into the subject of today's discussion, a few housekeeping and administrative remarks. Participants joining as attendees will have their cameras and mics off by design to accommodate the larger number of participants. Participants are strongly encouraged to post their questions in the chat using the Q&A function at any time during our event. Please also indicate your name and affiliation if you so wish. As time permits, I will relay these questions to the floor or to the specific panelists that you indicate during the Q&A segment that will follow our discussion. Should any questions go unanswered because of the time constraints, we will follow up with panelists to provide you with a response bilaterally after the event. Please also note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on UNIDIR's and UNODA's website following the event. Now turning to our panel. I'm very happy to be joined today by 3 fantastic speakers. We have with us Wien Swinnenberg. Wien is a project leader on humanitarian disarmament at PAX, a humanitarian Netherlands-based peace organization. He has been doing research and advocacy work on a wide range of issues related to military drones since 2011 and published numerous reports on these developments in Syria, Iraq, Ukraine, Africa, and specific reports on Sudan and Ethiopia. He was also the coordinator of the European Forum on Armed Drones and is now exploring the novel ways of drone use by state and non-state actors. We also have with us Dr. Carrie Chavez. Carrie is an assistant professor in the Military and Strategic Studies Department at the U.S. Air Force Academy. She's also a non-resident research fellow with the Institute for Global Affairs, a two-time non-resident fellow with the Modern War Institute at West Point, and an advisor for Project Air and Space Power at the Irregular Warfare Institute. Her research focusing on politics, strategies, and emerging technologies of modern warfare and security has been published in several venues. The views she expresses are hers and do not reflect the official position of the US Air Force Academy, Department of the Air Force, or Department of Defense. And last but certainly not least, we also have with us Abby Zid. Abby is a legal advisor in the Arms and Conduct of Hostilities Unit of the Legal Division of the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, in Geneva. She specializes in urban warfare and the conduct of hostilities more generally. Abby has also worked for the ICRC's Thematic Legal Advisors Unit in Geneva and at its delegation at the United Nations in New York. Prior to joining the ICRC, Abby also served the Australian Army as both a signals officer and a legal officer. Now, and with no further delay, to kickstart our discussion, I would like to first turn to you, Vin. You've been following developments regarding the proliferation and use of UAVs and leading PAC's impressive research and policy work on this critical issue for several years. I was wondering if you could provide us with an overview of how the use of both armed and unarmed UAVs by state has evolved in recent decades, and also on how these systems have been deployed to support military operations, both within and outside situations of armed conflict. Thank you, and the screen is yours.
Thank you, Barbara, and also thanks to UNIDIR, UNODA, and to the protocol for hosting this important session. As Barbara mentioned in the introduction, we've been, as a PAX, as a peace organization, have been tracking the use of military drones since 2011. And the reason why we got into this particular topic was because the ongoing clandestine drone operations by states to target suspected militants outside areas of armed conflict, which was back then the drone became the tool to identify, track, trace, and target these kind of militants. But it also went hand in hand with an enormous risk to civilians, with thousands of strikes being carried out. There have been hundreds of civilian casualties, often with no transparency and accountability for innocent civilians which were killed in those kind of strikes. And this also started a debate within the humanitarian disarmament community. Okay, what are the implications of those novel technologies? Why they became so popular? And to clarify a little bit on why states, in this particular case, a handful of states turned to military drones, was because they were able to fly over a long distance over a certain period, in particular in areas which are inaccessible for troops on the ground, and drones having oversight and surveillance capabilities with sensor systems, cameras, night vision, etc., and also being armed with precision munitions. Was considered to be an ideal tool for those agencies, because those are particular intelligence agencies, not so much the armed forces who are carrying out those strikes. At the same time, human rights organizations, UN special rapporteurs were warning against the implications of those kind of strikes, and also fearing that the legal justification for the use of the use of lethal force outside of areas of armed conflict, and the legal justification, therefore, was undermining international legal principles. However, this debate was largely not being picked up in the UN. There was limited pushback against those kind of practices, and the concern was if there was no pushback, other states could easily imitate and also apply similar methods, as drone proliferation was rapidly expanding worldwide. And this is exactly what happened. In particular, from the year 2015 onwards, in the last decades, we've seen other states joining the global defense market, developing relatively low-cost military-grade drones that are and have been exporting them to various areas, which are now being used in both intrastate conflict, interstate conflict, cross-border operations, which has now serious implications for peace and security, which we'll come back to that later. So drones have become, because of their low cost, their accessibility, their maneuverability, and able to operate over a long period over areas which are largely inaccessible or dangerous, become this sort of key tool for states to use them. And at the same time, we see also a shift by non-state actors or by states supporting non-state actors with military-grade drones to use them in these kind of operations, or non-state actors using one-way explosive drones to target long range capabilities to target all kinds of infrastructure, shipping, as we've seen this week again in the Red Sea. And that's sort of a new development that's taking off. And also we'll talk about, I think, later about non-state armed groups, but that's sort of what set the stage for military drones at the moment. And there are numerous examples of states we can go into, but for the introduction, I think that was sort of setting the stage. That sort of was driving the global drone and developments and drone warfare specifically.
Thank you so much, Vin. It's very interesting and that's useful historical review and perspectives on the evolving nature of drone operations by states and provide some critical context to our discussions. I would like now to turn to you, Carrie. You've conducted extensive research in the past on how non-state armed groups have been leveraging this technology to advance their own security interests. And especially in recent years, we've witnessed an impressive growth in the number of such groups that are using UAVs in their operations. Could you perhaps elaborate on some of the factors that are influencing the adoption and deployment of UAVs by non-state armed groups? And also perhaps touch upon some of the main trends with regards to how such groups use the systems across regions. Thank you, and screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you also again to all of the partners and institutions that are making this webinar possible. It is such an important and timely topic. And thank you to my colleagues for joining the conversation. So the factors that influence adoption and use has actually changed a lot over the era of drones. Before the commercial drone era, which normalized around 2012, 2013, this was primarily just the very innovative and entrepreneurial groups, and also the ones that were able to attain state sponsorship and get access to these military-grade drones that Vin was talking about. Since commercial drones, small drones, and we do have to be mindful about the immense drone diversity involved here, because it does stem from a small Amazon drone all the way up to the most exquisite state military drones. So since that time, a lot more violent non-state actors have been able to attain crewed aerial power. And they have primarily responded to their security environment. I mean, that's a major driver. The novelty of the platforms, the normative allure was one of the early factors that was driving these actors to look to them. But over time, the pathways that primarily lead to adoption now I'm going to highlight two of them. One are networks. So after these actors, these really innovative actors initially took these up and started demonstrating the utility and the multi-use flexibility of these aerial platforms, other groups started paying attention. And for anyone who studies violent non-state actors, they usually take what we call a small world format. So they have these clusters of particularized in-group trust that they form. And when a demonstration point or an idea drops into those clusters, it then diffuses through those kind of constructivist bubbles. So initially, it took one of those innovative groups taking it up and demonstrating the utility in those groups, and then it started diffusing through those groups. So we saw some regional examples of this. This did begin mostly in the Middle East, and it appeared initially to be a Middle East phenomenon. But then we saw it start to transfer to other regions and then start to suffuse those regions as well. Anymore, I think another of the main pathways, it doesn't have to be specifically through networks, either through allies or enemies demonstrating it. There are also just broad, large-scale demonstration points in the world. So the Russia-Ukraine war was a big one, because we did see several instances of violent non-state actors using this, but that was at such a scale in the Russia-Ukraine war. It was also so highly globalized in the media. So we saw more violent non-state actors observing the innovative ways that state militaries were responding to this. So now we're seeing kind of a cross pressures from both non-state actors and state actors and the way they're using this. In terms of the trends, the way they're using them, it's many. And I think that's one of the reasons why there is such an allure of these platforms. They provide the ISR capability, and Barbara's team's report on drone use and deployment in Africa talks about how prevalent the ISR component is. And I know that's not the most sensational in headlines, but it is really meaningful for how it enables them to advance their agenda, to improve every aspect of their combat. So that is one major piece. It also enables them to develop really keen propaganda. It allows them to sometimes provoke stronger actors, often states, to respond with much more expensive defensive tools. So it allows them to do this attrition of asymmetrically strong adversaries. Of course, we know that they have found ways to weaponize this, ranging from dropping kind of makeshift munitions all the way up to these precision munitions that Vim is talking about because of state transfers. So they have been able to perform these high value target strikes. So the Houthis have been able to target these both commercial and military vessels. They've actually used these sort of hybrid, or in some cases, military grade drones to strike governments and military officials and military parades. There was an incident back in 2019 where a group attempted to assassinate the Venezuelan president with it. So we do see some emulation of the targeted strikes in violent non-state actors. It also allows them to disrupt and intimidate a lot of processes ranging from the political to the economic to the civilian. And in some cases, they use it for smuggling. So there's the whole cartel transnational criminal world. So just overall, in terms of regions, this is a highly diverse, highly scalable capacity across the whole violent non-state actor world. Of course, the Middle East, of course, Africa, as Barbara's report highlights, it's being used in Asia. It's very dense in Myanmar. It was very common in Afghanistan. You have Latin America, and of course, the Western nations. So the only continent I'm aware of that it's not being used fairly densely is Antarctica so far. So.
Thank you so much, Carrie, for sharing this very valuable insights into non-state armed groups' use of UAVs. I particularly appreciate your perspectives on the role of networks in enabling the diffusion and knowledge transfers, not only of the technology itself, but also of tactics in deploying these systems between and among groups, and also on how these groups can learn not only from each other, allied groups, but also through observation and emulation of enemies. And as you've pointed out, it's a factor that also emerged very prominently doing our own research at UNIDIR when exploring trends in non-state armed groups' use of uncrewed systems in Africa and in many other contexts as well. And I think this work has been crucial to contextualize and advance the understanding of these trends. I would like now to turn to you, Abby. We've discussed general trends in terms of how both states and non-state armed groups are using these systems in different contexts, but perhaps to anchor these discussions in a more solid legal basis, I was wondering if you could speak about some of the risks and benefits that the use of the systems by an increasingly diverse set of actors, as we are seeing, can present with regards to the protection of civilians during armed conflict, especially when compared with crewed systems. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Barbara. Can you hear me well? Perfect. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone listening. It's a pleasure to be here to chat with you about some of the risks and benefits associated with uncrewed aerial systems. So a question you asked me was, how are these actors using them and what are the risks and benefits? And I think probably it's a good thing to point out that we have that increasingly diverse set of actors using these systems, of course, armed actors, states and non-state armed groups, but also civilians. And they are increasingly being used for a variety of humanitarian purposes during armed conflict, both by humanitarian actors, but also by militaries as well. So, and the reason why being is that their ability to use these systems can operate in dangerous and inaccessible areas, which make them useful when it comes to facilitating compliance with some key IHL obligations. And so we can think of some of the obligations relating to the delivery of impartial humanitarian relief and assistance, the provision of medical care to the wounded and sick, treatment of displaced persons. There's a strong legal framework in relation to those people. And also when it comes to the clearance and risk reduction activities related to explosive remnants of war, but also for accountability reasons when it comes to repression and suppression of serious IHL violations and more generally. So, I mean, it's just to give some examples. I mean, we have seen these systems used for, real-time monitoring of conflict zones to help humanitarian actors understand the dynamics of the conflict and where civilians are most at risk. Enabling rapid assessment of damage in conflict-affected areas, for example, collapsed buildings, identifying safe passages, monitoring humanitarian pauses, the tracking and movement of displaced people to better understand needs and where to provide assistance, but then also search and rescue activities, so locating survivors in remote areas or in the rubble, and getting rescue teams to that location. So there are also other key examples related to, delivering food and water and medical supplies and other essential goods in certain areas that are difficult to access. I talked a bit about, identifying and mapping of in-place devices such as landmines and explosive remnants of war. UAS can be very useful in helping to do that mapping and then help demining teams to, clear those hazards safely and facilitate safer movement for the civilian population and reduce the risk to civilians. So there are other, functions such as, improving communication and connectivity when communications infrastructure has been destroyed in an area. Certain UAS might be able to perform a role as a temporary communication relay, providing connectivity for humanitarian organizations and affected communities, which is very important to disseminate information to the civilian population. And then, of course, the important point of documentation and reporting that, the imagery and videos captured from UAS can do to, raise awareness about the humanitarian impact of conflicts. So there are, of course, risks associated with the use of UAS for humanitarian purposes, and a lot of those relate to personal data collection, unintentional surveillance and data over collection being one example. There are data security risks from, because of vulnerability to breaches, and then also the misuse of the data that's collected, whether it be, shared for unauthorized purposes, and then some other impacts on populations themselves from using UAS for humanitarian purposes. So then if we look at the use of these capabilities in military operations, which we've already discussed briefly, we've already discussed in the other two speakers, that there are certainly legal and operational risks when it comes to using them in military operations, and even those unarmed UAS that they can actively enable lethal strikes in a wide variety of ways. And in one sense, these types of unarmed uncrewed aerial systems can really expand the scope, the range, and lethality of strikes. And it can then sort of enable strikes that may have otherwise been deemed too dangerous or unlawful or even physically impossible by other more crude means. So we're seeing these systems being used for intelligence and target acquisition and target designation, artillery spotting, which can help improve target location and also supporting fire correction. Sort of developments when it comes to manned and unmanned teaming between manned aircraft as well as an unmanned system, and then electronic attack or electronic warfare measures, which can have implications for the civilian population. We're also seeing UAS be employed for the conduct of battle damage assessments, which we can discuss a little bit later. But in terms of understanding the effectiveness of strikes that have happened. And then we've also seen them be used for potentially enabling surrender of opposing forces. So there's a wide range of things that can be done with these systems, and there are certainly risks and benefits that can come with it. And I know that one of the sort of the arguments in using these systems is that, well, you know, it can improve your ability to identify certain targets and anticipate civilian harm from your attacks. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that it makes warfare any less destructive. And it doesn't mean that it reduces the risk to civilians. And I'm sure that we will get into that discussion a little bit later when we discuss some of the other points. But I'll throw back to you, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Abby. I think very clear and helpful overview of the different risks and benefits associated with the use of UAVs in supporting humanitarian operations, but also of the various challenges that we raise is both legal and operational in the conduct of military operations. So thank you very much, and very important for framing our discussion, and I think also a good segue to our next round of questions, which will tackle the broader impacts resulting from the use of these systems from different perspectives. And on this, I would like to turn again to you, Vin. Based on your extensive research with PACS that, as you noted, has examined such use cases across a range of contexts and conflicts, what are some of the impacts that the growing proliferation and potential misuse of armed and unarmed UAVs by different actors can pose to human as well as to international security and stability? Thank you, and over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So they're basically what we've seen in the past. We talked about like the clandestine drone wars in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. But the last decade, we've seen states copying that. So, for example, in northern Iraq and northern Syria, or Syria as a whole, states have been using drones to target suspected militants as well. For example, in Syria, recently the US admitted to mistakenly targeting a shepherd, which was considered to be thought to be a Al-Qaeda terrorist. But those kind of implications are, you know, the killing of innocent civilians outside of areas where states are active. We've seen a similar drone campaign by Turkey against the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is, according to Turkey, is associated with the PKK, to which Turkey has been in a long-term war with. There have been strikes at militants or suspected militants in northern Syria, but also targeting where have been noted civilians being killed and wounded as well. In general, this leads to they have been also using drones to strike energy infrastructure because it's claimed to be financially supporting the YPG or the SDF. But as a result, we've seen those kind of strikes impacting civilian life because there's no electricity anymore. There's a lack of fuel. So all these kind of weapon systems are now being used for this kind of operations, but it's also impacting civilian life. In northern Iraq, in Iraq in general, we've seen militias being provided military-grade drones, which they have been used to target military bases, but in some occasions also civilian targets, which is also increasing fear and displacement in certain communities. And at the same time, we've seen also in conflicts, for example, in Ethiopia, where military drones have played a significant role eventually, where Ethiopia was fighting a war in Tigray against the Tigray Defense Forces, and drones provided by different states to, for example, Iran and Turkey and China to Ethiopia were helped able to shifting the tide. But at the same time, which was also quite disturbing, we've seen, despite all these kind of advantages, so high precision weapons, high technology that's able, like sensor systems and cameras, which should be able to make a distinction between civilians and combatants, as explained by Abby. Despite all that, we've seen strikes on clear civilian targets, IDP camps, civilian meetings, which also raises the question around accountability. So if states do have all these technological means to improve their targeting and prevent civilian casualties, why do we still see these kind of things occurring? A similar incident happened also in December last year in Nigeria, where a drone strike and a double tap drone strike hit a funeral it was a funeral or a wedding, correct me if I'm wrong on this one, but it was a large gathering of civilians, which was struck twice by military drones. So that has both implications on civilian population who are could be a victim of strikes by states, even if it's fighting against another state armed group. It's also raises questions over the legal justification and victim compensations in those kind of operations. So there could be a decrease of trust from into the government force in government use of lethal force, which could also undermine government campaigns, but also which could also have implications for potential support for our armed groups if those mistakes keep occurring. And at the same time, having armed groups that have military grade drones and have been attacking, for example, now as we've seen over the last couple of months, has severe implications by attacks with those kind of drones on shipping routes, which could be potential larger economic implications. And in some occasions, there have been potential miscalculations. So we've seen with Iran shooting down US drones, we've seen the US shooting down Turkish drones. Those kind of miscalculations could potentially be a trigger for a larger war. Well, at the same time, people would also argue that because it was a drone, it actually prevented a larger attack. But that remains to be seen. I mean, it's all, but because of the perceived absence of risk, states might be more eager to use drones and also lethal force in operations or areas where they previously wouldn't have used military force. And also as a subsequent or as a result of that, it also makes it often more difficult for human rights researchers or for investigators to verify claims of targets that have been struck by states and the justification used for that. So yeah, those are like the risk and implications that precision might give a false sense of security for states to strike targets, or the perceived absence of risk might states more bolder to use them in operations where they otherwise wouldn't have used drones, which is lowering the threshold of the use of force, but also could have an escalation effect. And for the non-state armed groups, there's a risk, of course, for having precision with technology. They're able to strike the targets they couldn't strike with other means, which is a good case. For example, even if it's a case of self-defense in case of Ukraine, but with striking targets deep inside Russia with military drones. And I could also easily see where this can be of interest to other states or non-state armed groups to develop these kind of capabilities and target certain kind of infrastructure that they wouldn't be able to target otherwise. So those are all kind of increased risks associated with these capabilities.
Yes, thank you so much, Wim. I think really important reminder about some of the consequences of the use of the systems when not used in line with international law and norms of accountability, and also of the how this may lead to also miscalculation and contribute to crisis and conflict escalation dynamics. And I think, as you've pointed out too, as the technology continues to proliferate, the need to address some of these concerns also becomes increasingly important. And now coming back to you, Carrie, I mean, as we've discussed, we know UAS technology is not only proliferating, but also advancing at a very rapid pace. And we are witnessing how technological innovations are also expanding the possible military applications of the systems, as they become almost an inescapable feature of battle spaces across the world. Could you perhaps elaborate on how you see advances in technology expanding the potential uses of UAVs by different actors, and perhaps also on what might be some of the impacts associated with such uses at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels of military operations? Thank you, and over to you.
Sure. I think this is such an interesting thing in the recent past, because there used to be such a large capacity gap between the commercial and military grade platforms. Even just a few years ago, the debate was, sure, terrorists have been able to buy Amazon drones, does it matter at all? And certainly there wasn't even a debate that states were going to kind of stoop to these child's toys for their military, toolkit. And as we've seen states take up small UAS and non-state actors gain access to the larger UAS, the military grade, through sponsorship, we're seeing all of these capacities really fill out and the gap sort of narrow. So you can get a very advanced micro drone that's uniquely suited to combat, whereas before it required this like malevolent creativity to take this child's toy and use it for a nefarious purpose. And now we have these tailor-made platforms across the whole spectrum of UAS diversity that are specifically designed for combat. So I think that's one thing we really have to think about, is that it's because the options available to any actor that chooses to turn to this are becoming more granular across that spectrum and a lot more advanced. So because there are so many different terrorist, rebel, insurgency, criminal, and then on the other side, from the state side, state agendas, like Vin gave us a really good overview of all the different ways that they're using them from the state arsenal. And as Abby traced, there's also a lot from just private industry, a lot of licit, benevolent uses to these technologies. It's just expanded the possibilities, the potential, the action potential of these flexible platforms. I think a lot of it just depends on the goals of the group or of the state using them. So it's hard to conjecture exactly the ways they may choose to. But I think another thing for us to think about as these advance, it's not just the platforms themselves, it's also their convergence with other technologies, because it's the hardware and then it's also the software, it's the avionics, and in some cases the armaments. And so we have to think about technologies like additive manufacturing or 3D printing, which makes these platforms easier to access in the first place, maybe to repair and replace. We also have to think about some advanced materials that are coming out that will just make them fly better. So things like innovations in power sources that will make them fly longer. Computing power, of course, we always have to talk about artificial intelligence, which will allow them to fly easier and more autonomously. So in every metric or in every technical specification, they are getting better, which enables actors to use them with greater latitude. I think there's a debate over the impact beyond the tactical operational. So the tactical impact, especially of these small, I mean, I call them tactical UAS, the very small ones that a lot of violent non-state actors use and that now states are starting to use. Abby mentioned a lot of aspects, like it extends reach, right? It improves situational awareness in a lot of cases. It definitely lowers risks, which improves survivability of users. It can increase lethality either from that platform or in tandem with another platform. So all of these things can shorten the tactical tempos of modern warfare. And of course, that really induces psychological pressure. So I think there's a lot of agreement about the impact they're having tactically. Operationally, which, I mean, that we're talking about a group's ability to synchronize those tactical activities to achieve some kind of broader objective. I do think in some cases, of course, states, to some degree, non-state actors have been able to accomplish operational objectives through UAS. So Nagorno-Karabakh was a great initial example. The Ukraine war, of course, is an example of the way this is changing the tides of war. Gaza is a good example. Hamas using them in the October 7 invasion, and then Israel later using these tactical small UAS and chaining them up to the strategic ones to attain their objectives. Hezbollah is rather good at this. Cartels and criminals are rather good at using them to coordinate with other tactical efforts. The big debate is over the strategic impact. And this is about securing ultimate aims. This is about winning or ending wars. And it's just, there's just less clear empirical evidence for this. So the question, I mean, is there even an impact? That is debated. And there are arguments that drones alone cannot win or end wars. I think there's also a question of what is the impact, if there is one, because on one hand, some argue that they do facilitate these, augmentation, force multiplication that allows for better strategic ends, but they might also cause backlash because of those risks that my colleagues have been talking about. They might actually undermine strategic objectives if they are causing more collateral damage, if they are killing more civilians that cause this retrogression of political progress in ending wars and in peace negotiations. So I think that one is very open to debate, and I welcome questions from the audience on the strategic impact of this, especially of the use of the whole spectrum from the small tactical up to the strategic.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And I do suspect you might have prompted a lot of comments and questions from the audience. So also just a reminder that please use the Q&A function to submit your questions at any stage of the event for our panelists, and we'll get to those during the Q&A. But now I think after discussing this multitude of impacts, I would like to turn back to you, Abby, again to first provide us with a legal perspective on some of these issues. In particularly, I was wondering if you could maybe shed some light on the legal frameworks governing the use of UAVs in military operations, primarily within, but also outside situations of armed conflict, and on how some of the current practices that we've been discussing may challenge such frameworks. Thank you, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Barbara. I won't speak to the entire legal framework governing the use of these systems in military operations within and outside of armed conflicts, because there is a lot of law. But I will focus in particular on the two international law frameworks that are very key, which is international humanitarian law and international human rights law. I won't talk about the jus ad bellum considerations, but I think to put it sort of upfront, I mean, the use of these systems is not prohibited under international law, but clearly the law circumscribes their use, and the operators that use them have to comply with either IHL or human rights law, depending on the context. And so, in armed conflict, when you're using these systems to either support or carry out attacks, you have to comply with the key rules governing the conduct of hostilities, that is distinction, proportionality, and precautions. When you're outside of armed conflict, well, the legality of using these systems is subject to far stricter limits on the use of force under international human rights law and standards. So now, of course, since you can use these systems for a variety of purposes other than targeting during armed conflict, IHL is not always going to apply to every use of these systems by a party to armed conflict. And the key question really is whether the military operation itself has a necessary belligerent nexus to the armed conflict, be it international or non-international armed conflict. Now, when it comes to looking at IHL or the law of armed conflict, there's nothing inherent. There are no inherent features related to the UAS that would prevent operators from observing the relevant features or rules of IHL. They're not prohibited in weapons treaties, customary law, or legal instruments of IHL, and they're not inherently indiscriminate or cause superfluous injury. And so the lawfulness of using these systems have to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. And it does depend on what those who were involved in the operation knew or should have known at the time of their attack, if they're conducting attacks, based on all of the information that was reasonably available to them in the circumstances at the time. So, of course, if you're using these systems to deploy prohibited weapons, such as anti-personnel landmines, cluster munitions, biological or chemical weapons, and certain conventional weapons, of course, that will be unlawful. And when you're using these systems as weapon systems, you have to conduct Article 36 weapons reviews. States have to, as part of their obligations under IHL, in particular, Additional Protocol 1, for those that are signatories to it, but it is customary. Many states apply that rule as customary. Now, as Wim has said, for a range of reasons, these systems, as well as Kerry, has said, they can permit a higher level of accuracy and precision in the targeting process, and they can help avoid, incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. And, higher levels of accuracy and precision is undoubtedly an improvement over inaccuracy, such as unguided weapon systems. These systems can allow for more accurate collateral damage estimates, and they might allow for these attacks to be cancelled or suspended at short notice. So in some senses, from an IHL perspective, provided their use is feasible in the given circumstances, using a UAS will be mandatory if it will avoid or minimize incidental civilian harm compared to another means or method of warfare. And similarly, if the only way of carrying out an operation without violating the prohibition of indiscriminate or disproportionate attacks is to use a UAS, then really the attacker has two options, and that is to use the UAS or not carry out the attack at all. But as importantly, to echo Wim's remarks, is that does not mean that each and every attack using these systems is going to comply with IHL, and particularly those rules on the conduct of hostilities. And nor will it remove the dangers that these weapon systems cause for civilians and civilian objects, particularly in populated areas when heavy explosive weapons are used. And there are a number of factors that are going to influence IHL compliance in this regard. And that, for example, the size of the munition that's being used when compared with the military objective itself, the type of guidance system that the UAS is using, since they can vary in accuracy and precision, and they can be affected by external factors such as jamming and interferences, and as well as the type of construction material, for example, in urban environments. One of the biggest issues is, of course, flawed and outdated intelligence and poor communications that leads to target misidentification, incorrect assessments of collateral damage or incidental harm that really doesn't reflect the reality on the ground, but also inaccurate and unprofessional reporting by UAS crews that can lead to important information either being ignored or downplayed when a strike is conducted. And then there are a number of other factors related to sort of the nature of the target that's being targeted. So even if you use these systems against, a precise attack against critical infrastructure that is being used by both military and civilians, then there are going to be significant direct and indirect or reverberating effects from targeting critical infrastructure for civilians. And so, and that is a huge concern for us and other humanitarian actors. And then there's the issue of targeting of people, particularly in non-international armed conflict, when that, identifying who is a lawful target can be quite complex, and not all states agree on the legal position on that. Of course, the ICRC has a view, and we've made that clear in our interpretive guidance on the notion of direct participation in hostilities, but some states don't accept that. And then I'll leave it there, but there are other factors that relate to precautions in attack when it comes to warnings and weaponeering decisions that will all feed into IHL compliance that are important to take into account when considering the use of these weapons, or the use of UAS for targeting purposes.
Thank you so much, Abby. A very enlightening and clear explanation of these different normative frameworks, and important reminder and reaffirmation of the role of legal norms, and particularly the key exposing rules of IHL governing the conduct of hostilities in relation to the use of the systems. I think the point also on flawed and outdated information and poor communication that can lead to target misidentification that we see can be one of the main causes of civilian harm during some contemporary military operations is also, I think, key to the discussion. And now, I think, to conclude this round of questions, I would like to pose one final and more forward-looking question, this time for all of you to address. And we already touched upon many of these issues during these two previous rounds now, but I would like and would be interested in hearing your views on what you believe are some of the emerging trends and developments that we are witnessing today likely to influence how the systems will be used by different actors in the future, and also on what lessons you believe can be drawn from the current use in military operations to better address the risks, but also harness the benefits that these systems can offer. And perhaps we can go in the same order again for your interventions, starting with Vin, then Carrie and Abby. Vin, the screen is yours.
Thanks, Barbara. And I was actually just reading upon one of the questions, so apologies for if you could repeat the question you were posing. I was looking in the Q&A for questions.
Yes, let me briefly repeat the question. And it would be if you could share your views on what are some of the emerging trends and developments that are likely to influence how the systems will be used by different actors in the future, and also on what lessons you think can be drawn from the current use in military operations to better address the risk, but also harness the benefits that they can offer.
Yeah. Okay, there are two different questions, but I think that the recent development, which is quite concerning, is at the moment we're tracking some of the drone use in Sudan, but also in, which is an interesting component where we see that non-state armed groups, and the same, and also in Syria, by the way, where non-state armed groups are developing long-range one-way explosive drones, who are basically military-grade drones. They're composed, they're built with commercial components, often make it difficult to track where they were coming from. So this goes beyond what we've seen in the past, for example, with ISIS and Hezbollah and others. And also they're not built on known models. So for example, it's fairly easy to trace back Iranian models of one-way kamikaze drones because they have a certain shape and size. And but we're now seeing more and more military-grade long-range kamikaze drones being used with new models, which indicates that there is sophistication among armed groups, likely state support with engineering in terms of guidance of those kind of drones to the targets. So they've been used now in Sudan by the RSF, the rapid support forces who are fighting the Sudanese armed forces. But we haven't, for example, seen they're completely consistent build out of commercial components, military-grade explosives, but with a fixed wing type of setup and GPS guidance, which indicates a sophisticated level of support. So that's one kind of development we're currently seeing, which could easily be copied and used by other states or groups. So, and also there, it provides states deniability, because again, with Iranian drones, it was quite obvious because of the composition of the drones and materials, it could be linked back to Iran. In Sudan, it's unclear. Although we have our suspicions, but like that's the one, but also, yeah, as mentioned also by Gary, the sophistication is increasing. The result of this is that all those kind of parts and components makes it difficult to capture them in arms export control mechanisms that currently exist, which are also very fragmented or limited in participation or not enforced. So the Arms Trade Treaty, for example, is usually mainly dealing with military-grade UAVs, which has to be reported. But if you have a capability and capacity to assemble these kind of effective military drones, make them in large quantities, which also makes it more difficult to intercept. They're very cheap. At the same time, they have the military precision and explosive payload. That poses like serious problems for states trying to combat either the illegal proliferation or accountability for states. So that's one major concern. At the same time, there's something also where states are probably more concerned of. We've seen non-state armed groups having the capability to shoot down armed drones. We've seen that in Yemen. We've seen it recently in northern Iraq, where the PKK has been provided also a type of missile that's likely from Iranian origin, either received directly from Iran or through Iraqi militia supported by Iran. And they have been quite effective in shooting down Turkish drones. So the countermeasures to drones are also growing. So those are two implications that we're currently seeing. And at the same time, the other application is like the rapid export of military-grade drones, for example, to Africa, but also to Central Asia, being used in cross-border strikes. And we've briefly touched upon it previously in strikes that killed large scores of civilians. In the case of Nigeria, the Nigerian government came forward and admitted their mistake. So that's one, a rare occasion where a state outright took responsibility for it. Other occasions has not happened, but those kind of cross-border operations, in particular in the area, we have a lot of armed groups moving around different borders, which also could create more tension. So I think that's one of the major elements. And moving forward on what should be done to address this, I think it's really important that states acknowledge the risk of these kind of developments and seek for policies to either identify potential misuse, clarify the legal position to push back on states trying to undermine existing legal interpretations of international humanitarian law and human rights law by clarifying their position on that, and make it more difficult for states who are using the sort of flawed definition of that to target suspected militants outside of armed conflict, and also trying to seek some kind of mechanism to improve export controls and have an overview of what are the current technological developments, how can we monitor that, engage industry in that as well, particularly commercial industry, to prevent parts and components ending up in the wrong hands for assembly, and also call out those kind of states who have been providing support with drones to non-state armed groups, which, for example, recently also there was a military drone intercepted on its way to Libya from a Chinese firm origin. It's of course not clear who's responsible for that, but those kind of deliveries are also still happening. So I think those are the kind of opportunities that we have now, where acknowledgement of the risks should be clearly outstated, and it's also been underscored by the UN Secretary General in his recent report. I think that's the way forward, where and also states being involved with industry to keep track of those developments and underline their risks and concerns in relevant international forums such as the UN General Assembly to ensure a response will be developed to those kind of risks and threats to peace and security from uncrewed systems.
So I'm going to try to make mine quick, kind of bulleted, so that if anyone wants to talk about them more, we'll talk about them in the Q&A. So I think some of the trends or developments that will influence the way these are used. One, I just want to highlight again, kind of like Abby's presence here, because that legal regulatory landscape will impact, especially the licit users, the norm abiding users, it will impact. And it's not just the laws themselves, but it's also the bureaucratic apparatuses to monitor and enforce them. So how many resources are the states and international partners willing to bring to bear on this issue, because this is not the only thing going on in the world, right? So we have scarce resources. So I do think that will make a big deal. The second thing that will impact the way they're used are counter UAS developments, because that world is thrumming along just as much as the UAS world in response. And in some areas where the UAS is densely used, it is mitigating their use. So the ability to identify and detect and neutralize those platforms is that there's an offense-defense dialectic that's going on. And in some places, they're becoming a lot less edgy in their ability to augment forces. I think another thing I want to highlight in the trends is the way that this might impact types of warfare. So urban warfare to some degree, maybe subterranean or those built up environments. There's a lot of evidence that the small tactical UAS provides a unique edge in those contexts. And so what does that mean for future modern warfare, which many scholars do predict that urban warfare will become more common? So if it enables it more, what is that relationship, that dynamic going to look like? In terms of the examples that we've seen actors harnessing the benefits and mitigating the risks well. One, and I'm not speaking normatively here, so I'm not saying that this is necessarily like good or bad, but just in terms of military efficacy, just the empirical aspect, by pushing air power down, that like multi-dimensional awareness down to the tactical level, where you have what they're calling in Ukraine these island force structures, it is enabling tactical units to be more effective on the front lines, to close the circle from target identification to neutralization. So I think that is one thing they're doing well with. One question, but something that my colleagues have highlighted, is data link security. So we've talked a little bit about electronic warfare, but we haven't gotten into the weeds on how that dynamic might influence the way these are used and how actors are trying to balance those things. Discerning hostile from friendly platforms is another one. So like remote identification technologies that will enable dense drone theaters to be governed more effectively. In some cases, again, this is just a military efficacy comment, but using small UAS as the first soldier into battle is having a significant effect on unit survivability. And I want to end, just like I started on the kind of legal regulatory stuff, I want to end on the potential discrimination in humanitarian elements, because, you know, Abby talked about battle damage assessment, and they can be used to improve the administration of just war. Even though war is almost always awful, they can make it more discerning if actors choose to use them in the right way, if they're responsible and accountable to that. And they can be used to improve humanitarian outcomes. So I know there's examples. There was an example in Gaza of a drone, like a loudspeaker carried by a drone into an area that was going to be attacked. So using them in ways like that, using them to observe those built up environments to improve discrimination. Again, of course, that depends on the user and the choices they make. So it's not technological determinism, but I think there are ways that with human ingenuity, these can be used to their maximum potential. Go for it, Abby.
Well, thanks so much. I mean, it's you've made a lot of points that I was certainly going to make on the urban warfare piece. I couldn't agree with you more in terms of, you know, urban warfare, whether we, you know, like it or not, it is going to continue to be the way in which where wars are conducted. So many conflicts are brought into cities these days for a range of reasons, and you know that has been a concern of the humanitarian community for a very long time, particularly because of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, especially those with wide area effects, which can also be deployed from UAS. So. Or UAS can support the use of these systems as well. And so, you know, absolutely agree with Wim's point on, you know, preventing or avoiding those flexible interpretations of IHL, particularly those rules on the conduct of hostilities that sort of enable, you know, force to be used within urban areas from these systems that is not compliant with, you know, a good faith interpretation of these rules is fundamental. And then connected to that is, you know, implementation of those key commitments that, you know, more than 87 states have made a couple of years ago on the explosive weapons in populated areas under the political declaration that was adopted. There are a number of really strong commitments to facilitate compliance with IHL in urban areas, and this UAS can be used in order to support with implementation of those obligations. Battle damage assessments was one that has been mentioned a bit. You know, we do know that there are militaries that, you know, will conduct battle damage assessments using UAS capabilities, which have certain limitations in urban areas, but then they don't always factor into those battle damage assessments the extent of civilian harm that has been caused, but rather they're focusing on the target that they've actually struck or whether they've effectively achieved their military objective. And so that was one of the key commitments that states made under the political declaration, is to do more to take into account the direct and indirect effects on civilians from the use of these systems in urban warfare. But also using these systems to improve situational awareness of an urban battle space, particularly if there are capabilities that, you know, more tactical level UAS that are able to get into areas that are difficult to reach, and also to improve those humanitarian outcomes. I think the other point that I would like to mention, and Kerry mentioned it earlier, is that, you know, AI, artificial intelligence and machine learning, we know that AI, you know, is being used and then also being explored in different ways, and in particular to enhance the autonomy of UAS systems, which all might allow for, you know, more advanced target recognition and threat assessment and decision-making capabilities without direct human intervention. And so for the ICSC, you know, we are concerned by the humanitarian implications that can arise from the use of AI, and in particular machine learning, by both militaries and non-state armed groups, in the sense that it can increase the risks imposed by autonomous weapon systems, and it can also negatively impact the quality of human assessments and judgments in warfare, which for us is we stress that, you know, it is really important to preserve the human judgment necessary to ensure compliance with IHL. And when it comes to autonomous weapons specifically, you know, we have been advocating for a long time about for states to adopt a new treaty on autonomous weapon systems that explicitly prohibit unpredictable autonomous weapon systems and anti-personnel autonomous weapon systems. So that is those that are designed or used to apply force against persons. But we also want to see, that new treaty implement sort of restrictions on the design and use of all other autonomous weapon systems. So limits on the types of target, on the duration, geographical scope and scale of use of these systems, the situations of use, and then to have requirements for human-machine interaction. So, and then the final point I just wanted to mention briefly, because Kerry did mention it, so important, counter-UAS measures, the types of measures that are being taken to counter these systems can also impact upon civilians. There are certain, when it impacts upon communications and navigation systems that civilians are using, as well as humanitarians, it can cause issues that reverberate. And so we also would like to sort of think more about how to reduce some of the risks for civilians when it comes to counter UAS. But I leave it there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Abby, but also, Vin and Kerry for raising these extremely important points on the latter, on countermeasures, but also on what we mentioned on loitering munitions or one-way UASs. It's also critical to the discussion and could easily fill an entire webinar, as well as many of the other points that were raised. Also, just to note some of the points that were mentioned by Vin, but also by other speakers in relation to some of the challenges that these developments can pose to export control regimes and arms control instruments more generally, that we'll examine some of these issues in greater detail in our final webinar of this series, which will look into frameworks and mechanisms that are currently in place to regulate the development, transfer, and use of UAVs, what gaps currently exist, and also what could be done to overcome these. So I will encourage you all to attend the event, and we will provide some more information later as well. But now, without taking any more time, I think we can move to the Q&A segment, our webinar, which you have around 10 to 15 minutes for the Q&A. I see we already receive some questions in the chat. And perhaps I would propose that we have 2 rounds, so I can read some of them, and maybe we could take turns and share your thoughts as you feel more relevant to your areas of expertise. But we have some questions on how, again, on like to elaborate more on the impacts of the increased proliferation and use of drones on regional security. I know, Vin, if you'd like to perhaps take this one, but also others feel welcome to weigh in. Then on the role of military training of UAV operators in mitigating the potential risks associated with the use in military operations. If Abby, you would like to take that one. We also have a question on how your assessment of the risks and benefits of using Uncrewed systems might change in low intensity versus large-scale combat operations. I don't know, Kerry, if you'd like to take this one, but also Abby and Vin, feel free to weigh in. So we can perhaps start with these 3 and then address the others that are coming in. Vin, would you like to start?
Yeah, also I just noted it was flagged as answered, but yeah, I'll try to answer a little bit on the regional security dimension. Of course, it really depends on which region, but because it's more complex often than just drones will play a role in it. But I think one of the examples I mentioned with the Red Sea and the use of one-way explosive drones to target shipping lanes, that is one element of like impacting basically the global economy by forcing ships to reroute, and also the regional environment, because there have been some oil spills occurring from the targeting of those kind of ships. But also we've seen the new coalitions that have been then in response to this kind of strikes have been formed to again bomb the Houthis, which is where the US has been leading on. which complicates those kind of dimensions. Whereas, for example, cross-border strikes of drones in Iraq and northern Syria, in this case in northeast Syria, where there is a serious decline in economic productivity and instability from the degraded infrastructure and the weakening of the military groups or the armed groups that are currently in control, which could, if in case of collapse of that, could pose more risks, because it's an area which is currently under control of the Kurdish-led SDF, which still has 50,000 or at least 10 to 20,000 IS fighters, and along with a couple of 10 or 20,000 families still on their control. So collapse of those kind of regions and subsequent escape of those IS detainants will still need to face justice. We could pose like a regional security risk for sure. So where drones have been a facilitating tool in striking those kind of or weakening at least the governance structure in that area and in the economy. Whereas we can see it now also with Hezbollah using both missiles and drones to strike the IDF, and that's for long term, of course, context there as well. But like having those kind of drones and missiles, or trying to ship those kind of missiles, so that the IDF been carrying out a lot of strikes inside Syria and Iraq against weapons transports, which increases tensions because Israel wants these armed groups to prevent having access to these kind of weapons. So there's a continuous fight going on there as well. So there always the response to the growing drone threat and the perception of that is provoking more strikes. Even Israel carried out strikes with drones against a drone factory in Iran, which was leaked by, or that leak was published by the New York Times, based on conversations with intelligence officials. So this whole dynamic is provoking more, could provoke more escalatory use of force. And I think that's one of the elements that where we see a risk of that. And the other sense, of course, like the ongoing perception that drones are an easy tool to solve a complex conflict by targeting key individuals, and that perception, that's required. We need to challenge that position that states have been taking, that you could technically kill your way out of a complex situation where armed groups are fighting states, and just by taking out key individuals, that you can solve that armed group. I think that perception needs to be challenged, in particular if there is risk of undermining legal principles for justifying those kind of strikes. Because again, it could also lead to more disgruntlement among civilian population, in particular if there are a lot of civilian casualties. So again, there's a whole range of escalatory problems that could undermine regional security with drones, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Wien. I think you also touched upon one of the other questions that we had in the chat on how the use of uncrewed systems in cross-border operations can contribute to crisis and conflict escalation as well. And perhaps for the next, Abby, would you like to?
Certainly, the question on training is absolutely fundamental. I mean, in terms of the best way to mitigate from a civilian harm perspective the risks is to have training on any capability that you use, and particularly for the operators of UAS, noting the fact that there are a wide range of UAS, and there is a very different level of training given to someone operating a tactical level UAS than compared with a remotely piloted aircraft, in terms of the qualifications and certifications that are needed, but also the types of activities that they're going to be getting involved in. And so, one of the things that we stress generally when it comes to the use of any form of weapon system is, target identification and incidental harm assessment training. What we find, is that particularly when it comes to the use of UAS capabilities, it tends to restrict the situational awareness, sort of that what they call the soda straw field of view when operators are using them, and they don't always get the sense of a complete understanding of the human environment or the civilian environment before conducting attacks. And so it's really important to sort of do find effective ways to use these systems that allow for a more comprehensive understanding of the battle space within which you're operating, to try and understand those, the key critical infrastructure nodes, the interdependencies between the infrastructure, and to try and understand how you might, if you're going to be using these systems for the conduct of targeting, how to minimize those direct and indirect effects. But also the training to understand how the various conditions that exist at the time will impact upon the use of these systems for targeting purposes. And the other thing is, the other really important aspect of training is that effective communication and coordination between those operators that are using the system. Because having effective procedures in that regard can ensure more accurate and more accuracy and precision in targeting operations. I think you asked if I also would like to touch briefly on the other question on large-scale military operations and low-intensity warfare. I think, and Kerry would be able to articulate this much more eloquently than me, but I mean, I think there's a huge difference, I suppose, in terms of how these capabilities are going to be used, because in in the lower intensity type of conflicts, then you're more likely to have one side with air superiority and able to use types of more advanced military systems at lower risk to their own forces. But in a larger scale military operation, we are going, as we have seen in Ukraine, going to see a lot more of the tactical, the use of tactical UAS and belligerents finding ways to adapt their tactics as to when they use these systems. And so there are risks when you're in the midst of a conflict, trying to adapt how you use systems if you haven't used them before in training, which need to be mitigated. But also there's going to be a focus on the cheaper systems that are more easily available and that can be used at the tactical level in a more efficient manner. Now, one of the benefits from that goes back to my point on situational awareness. If you are at the tactical level and these systems can improve your situational awareness about the civilians within this the area you operate, then that is a really important way to mitigate harm. But of course, there is that time factor in large-scale military operations where decisions are being made at a more decentralized, lower level. There's reduced time for decision making, which can reduce the precautions that are that can be feasibly carried out in the targeting process, which is that also a key consideration for militaries. But Kerry will be able to say it much better than I can on that question.
Not better. I'll just highlight some different aspects, I think. And I don't think there's one good answer to this question because there's so many nuances to it. But in low intensity conflict, I think it depends so much. It depends. That's always the answers that I give. It depends. Let me explain. In those low intensity ones, depends on the combatants, what they're going for, and it depends on how they're using the UAS, because there's a lot of scholarly literature that shows that if you change the information of the actors, of the combatants on each side, that usually shortens conflicts. So if they're using them to leverage informational edges, then that might actually be a benefit. However, if they are using them, especially like a weaker actor using them for attrition, and if they're able to access these affordable replacements that enables them to continue to fight and to continue to conserve their resources for a long battle, well, they might actually increase the duration of the conflict. And again, there's debates on how it would influence the ultimate outcome and aftermaths of conflict, especially when we think about all of the military instruments and not just UAS. So I think it's unclear. It depends on that. In terms of the large scale operations, this, again, depends on how the combatants harmonize all of the different components of the military arsenal. So it could be that, I mean, Abby was talking about more about the large scale combat operations, but it could be that they have a lot of finesse in using them in a way that enables the strategic objectives to trickle down to operational and tactical activities. It may be, though, that they are sort of myopic and overly focusing on this one instrument of power to their detriment. So I really think this question depends more on the human perspective and the human ability to leverage this platform in concert with the rest of the military assets, their ability to manage complexity in modern warfare, to steward their resources, less so than the actual features, the attributes of UAS themselves.
Thank you so much for all of you. I think extremely insightful contributions and answers. So we are running a bit out of time. I'd just like to do perhaps another quick round. I think we already touched upon some of the other questions. They were in the chat. There's a question actually on how to ensure future regulations and countermeasures can stay effective against evolving threats, consider rapid advance in technology. And for this, again, I would encourage you to join our next webinar. There is one question related to developments with regards to the weaponization of commercial systems. I don't know if Vin, either you or Carrie would like to weigh in on this one. Also, another one on how willing or able have actors been so far, armed actors, states, humanitarian organizations, to use Uncrewed systems for the positive uses and impacts that they can have, that all of you touched upon. I don't know if, Abby, if you have some thoughts on this. And then two interrelated questions that are more related to public security aspects. Well, one on whether you would consider the possibility of public security agents to have portable anti-drone systems to fight these threats. And another one that it's a case where an explosive drone was launched from a small drone, and taking into account what has been described as human ingenuity and urban warfare considerations, if you consider the importance of a national doctrine in terms of public policies for social awareness and combating internal malicious use of uncrewed systems. Yeah, for that one, I don't know if Carrie, you have any thoughts, but in any case, I'll give you the floor, perhaps again, Vin, for you to start with, yeah, any thoughts you'd like to share on any of those questions. Thank you.
Yeah, on the commercial side, I'll brief. That's indeed one challenge we've seen, for example, with Ukraine. We're talking now about potential millions of drones, commercial drones, first-person drones that are being produced, or at least set to be produced and delivered to Ukraine, which, this is the kind of example where we likely see the defense industry playing into the large-scale production of those kind of drone systems and deliveries, which also comes with the risk of misuse, in particular in security context, like in non-conflict context, which in particular I think intelligence agencies and police forces would see it as risk for misuse by armed groups or by criminal gangs or terrorists. And it's also posing, of course, military challenges, because I think the swarming technologies with the larger amount of drones at the same time, that's going to be a real risk for the future. But again, the commercial side, the production of those kind of components, which are not currently classified or not being falling under existing export control regulations, is going to pose serious challenges for keeping control over what's being produced and exported. So I think that's going to be the main issue in terms of those kind of FPV drones. The other commercial issue would be what I mentioned earlier, and I'm not going to detail again, but like how commercial components are able to assemble really heavy military-grade, long-range suicide drones, and also the lack of tracing back who is responsible for that. That's going to be a challenge. So keep controls on that would be think a challenge that needs to be addressed by proper policies.
Thank you very much, Vin. I don't know if Carrie, if you would like to go.
Sure. So I'll answer real quick, Captain Silva. Should states have national doctrine, public policies for, you mentioned social awareness, but also combating internal activity? It depends on the state. If you have this problem, yes, you absolutely should. I would point you to the Berlin Memorandum that's put out by the Global Counterterrorism Forum. It's a fantastic document that sketches how states can and should respond to this and the resources available to them. And they are in the process of trying to operationalize that and provide concrete ways that states can bring some of these abstract ideas down to their national context, because it does need to be contextualized to the types of malicious actors in your space, the resources you have, the other threats in your threat landscape. But I think just simply, yes, that should be considered as a routine assessment among others. And should, one of the other questions in the open section is, should public security officials have anti-drone capabilities? If it is warranted, if there is an imminent or potential threat, probably. But like Abby said, we need to make sure that those counter UAS solutions are appropriate for the setting, are legal, and that their application is just, and that they continue to be updated as this changes. How willing and able have actors been to use unmanned systems for positive uses? I think there's a lot of examples of them doing that. It's just not as spicy to talk about. We don't worry about those things as much, so we don't have webinars like this on those things. But I think there are a lot of examples of, all the way from the local up to the national, of actors leveraging these technologies for good. In my previous institution, I worked with a group of engineering students that were trying to design a way to transport organs for organ transplants via UAS, especially when it's so time imminent and you need to get through maybe like an urban landscape. So I think there's tons of examples of individuals and organizations identifying benevolent and sometimes benign uses for this. That's certainly the reason why we have these conversations, because we don't want those to stop, but we have to find ways to mitigate the malicious uses at the same time.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Abby?
Thanks so much. I'll be brief. I mean, on the question, I think, because Kerry covered it very well. How willing have actors, armed actor states and humanitarian organizations been to implement the positive uses. I mean, there are plenty of examples when it comes to the use of these systems that can have humanitarian outcomes. One of the challenges and the difficult conversations to have with militaries who are conducting operations is trying to balance the military necessity components with the protection of the civilian population. They, in military operations, they have limited resources to conduct their operations. They never have as many resources as they want, and at the same time, some of the things that they are expected to do for both IHL compliance, but also for implementing their commitments that they've made, or a number of states have made under the political declaration on explosive weapons in populated areas. Well, a lot of those require the allocation of resources, and that is time, things and people. And that means that you have to train and sustain those people before you end up in military operations. And so and you have to implement it in doctrine, and there's a lot that needs to be done. And so there are some challenging conversations we have with those states where they say, well, what more can we do? We don't have the resources. And then there's some, we have these difficult questions saying, well, you do have legal obligations related to precautions in attack, for example, where you have to take all feasible measures to avoid or reduce or minimize civilian harm. And when you're talking about what is feasible, it's not just about what is from a military perspective, but also from the humanitarian perspective. But those are ongoing conversations that we have, and important ones. And with perspective, people they're both kind of perspectives that need to be taken into account, and finding ways to move forward together to produce more humanitarian outcomes.
Great. Thank you so much, Abby. I'm afraid we've run out of time, so have to wrap up now. And with that, I would like to warmly thank once again all our speakers, Abby, Carrie, and Vin, for their very insightful contributions during today's webinar. I think it was a very interesting and rich discussion and a great way to give continuity to this webinar series. Thanks also to our partners from UNODA and also the government of Portugal for the support for this series. And speaking of the series, and as noted earlier, I would like to point out that we will have the third and final webinar on the 5th of September, which will explore actions that the multi-stakeholder community can take to address the threats associated with the uncontrolled proliferation and misuse of uncrewed systems. So also a very good way to continue these discussions and pick up on some of the critical issues that we began to explore today. And I hope you can join us for that as well. You also receive from us an online feedback survey after the conclusion of today's event, and perhaps already in the chat. And I would like to encourage everyone to complete the form. It only takes a couple of minutes, and it's very helpful for us to improve our events. And with that, thank you very much again for joining us today. Have a great afternoon here in Geneva and a great day or evening, depending on where this finds you online. Thank you.